Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We are back with a small print, and today my guest is Dr. Lehohla. As always on the show, we ask our guests to introduce themselves. So over to you. How do you introduce yourself today? Who are you? What do you care about? And what are you doing these days?
What a difficult question. It's a loaded question. I thought I was going to just say I'm Pali Lehohla, but it looks like there's a whole lot of things of who is this person. What I did was to participate in running Stats SA, a position I held for 17 years as a statistician general. But I've been in the statistics environment for 35 years, 17 of which I was not 17, but a number of those I was in Botswana, where I worked from 1982 to 1995, which is 13 years, and then the 22 years I was at the head office in Pretoria, 17 of which I was the statistician general. When you deal with numbers, they give you privilege to know what people do. You go into inner secrets of people's lives and people's businesses. And you have to be trustworthy when people open up to you like that, both in your official capacity, and obviously there is the private that is labeled official, but you have to provide the necessary confidence and respect and trust amongst nations, amongst people. I usually argue that statistics is a conduit of trust, and only those who can be trustworthy can participate in it, because you enter these secret places amongst people and business. That's what I've been doing. Currently, I'm a director of Economic Modeling Academy, which is an expansion and extension of the work that I did at Stats SA. Worried that I don't see people using statistics, I realized that there has to be a process by which you introduce them in the use and why statistics is useful. I'm sure everybody knows it's useful, but the conduct of people is that it doesn't prove to be so, and the best way to bring them and draw their attention to this is for them to understand the numbers, what they imply, and how they have to respond to what the numbers put before them, like high unemployment numbers in South Africa. What do you do? How do you reduce that unemployment, and how do you pursue the objective of eliminating it, if at all possible, if it's possible to eliminate it? So that's who I am, but I'm also a director of Pan-African Institute for Evidence, which really links to the Economic Modeling Academy. I'm a professor of practice at UJ. I'm a research associate at Oxford University, particularly looking at multidimensional poverty indices, how they are computed, and how their presentation and looking into them becomes an important platform for changes in policy. That's who I am. I'm now in Addis, where we are looking at data innovation labs, and we have a number of African countries here. And I'm using my background as statistician to intervene in that space. Thanks. A long introduction.
Well, that's what you do. You look at numbers. I mean, of course, the statistics field does have its fair share of criticism. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the trite little sayings like there's lies, damned lies in statistics. But as you were getting to, you're saying that the truth does lie in the numbers, but how those numbers are presented and shared can obviously give us very, very different stories that can be used to reinforce either productive or less productive narratives. And I just can't help thinking about some of the charts that are doing the rounds on social media at the moment with regards to climate change, right? So depending on what time frame you choose to look at global temperatures, if you look back sort of 8 years, it looks like there's no warming at all. If you look back 50 years, it looks like it's quite dramatic. If you zoom back 2,000 years, again, the story changes quite a lot. So how do you actually from your vantage point, how do you get the numbers to speak the plain truth and not be used as a political tool to reinforce agendas? Because numbers are so tied up with politics. And these are conversations we've had on this show quite a lot, like what gets measured, gets managed, gets manipulated. And how do you take something that is actually truth? I mean, it's we know we have these stupid debates again on social media, like 1 + 1, does it really equal 2? Or is that a colonial sort of imposition of ideas onto us right now? How do you actually have productive conversations in a world like today, where even facts can be portrayed as opinions? Do you have any comment on how we get to sort of actually get back to the truth and looking at the actual numbers and the ways to actually solve those problems?
Oh my God, you are moving into the philosophy of science and the question of objectivity and science and measurement through science, particularly of the nature of the work that I do as a statistician, as objective. And that's at the ground of it, at the bottom of it, is the question of the philosophy of science and how objective is the number or the things that we present. COVID has made this field and landscape a lot more complex, and then of course climate change, where individuals themselves argue and articulate on the basis of what they have observed, what they have had, and then the information technology is it's not making our life that easier, because we do not know whether this is fake or this is true. And of course, the virtual world also presents things as you do not know whether this is a human being or in the virtual space or is in its real life. So things are getting a lot more complex, and more so in the field of measurement. Certainly, the definition of objectivity and the quantitative surveys are said to be objective, because you can replicate, you can draw a sample, come to conclusions, you can keep distance as you do the measurement. Very interesting set of principles that I've grown by, and I made them my career. So take, for instance, when we measure population size, you design a system that enables you to be auditable by a whole range of other people. And this is governed in our space by what is called official statistics and fundamental principles for official statistics, which are the UN laws adopted in 2014 as the universal law of how we conduct this business of collection of data. Based on that, you really find the reality around the numbers, such as the people unemployed and so on. So it doesn't become easily contestable that that number is the number. So these things really depend on how well the design of the methods and how they are engaged in, how much independence is in this process, how much of methodology is in the process, and above all, how the time series has behaved year in, year out, because the only benefit in particular of statistics is time series. When you break time series, you destroy the value of statistics. So in the main, it is these methods that are science-based. They originate from mathematical sciences, and you use them to handle the measurement. And thus far, they have not really failed us when you measure what is the precision of this. And of course, as statisticians, is a subject of measuring uncertainty, and you become quite articulate and very clear around the level of your uncertainty around what you are measuring, and you call that confidence limits around what you are seeing.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the issue of the quality of the actual data that you are collecting and the validity over time, like you're saying. But there's also the question of, are we looking at the right things? So someone in your position, obviously very close to academia, you've also worked in the sort of public sector quite a lot. are we actually collecting data on the right things if we're wanting to solve the real problems in our society? And we'll get back to the problems that you look at most closely, particularly that of poverty and inequality in a moment. But do you think we're missing any tricks there? Because of course, to build up time series data, you have to be measuring that data over a long period of time in a consistent manner, not just domestically, but actually internationally. So you've got some sort of comparisons and benchmarks. Are we doing ourselves disservice as people who are trying to improve the future at a global level as well as a national one in terms of the data that we are collecting? Are we missing tricks because we've just decided or haven't thought about collecting that particular set of data? Or is it more a case of perhaps the data that's missing is missing for valid reasons, such as it's just too hard to collect? But I just wanted to ask you that question. Do you think there's any big data sets that we should be tracking as humanity, as academia at large, that we are not looking at that could actually serve us well in the future?
Tunki, a philosopher, says that the right answer to the wrong question is not very useful. Better have half an answer to the right question. So half an answer to the right question is worth much more than the right answer to the wrong question. And most of the time we ask the wrong questions. And asking the right questions is really very tough. It's very hard. One of the questions that we asked during the World War, the First and the Second World War, was what causes all these wars because of macroeconomic imbalances. And as a consequence, we developed something called the national accounts. And the national accounts was the instrument to try and understand these imbalances, which revisited us in 2008 and then revisited us as well as a consequence of COVID-19. The question is, are we measuring the right things? Is GDP an overused instrument? Is it abused? Indeed, it is abused because in the first instance, it was an attempt to try and understand how do we avoid going into war? But it looks like it's an instrument itself of driving us into war. Countries have chased the GDP, and Iwela Okonjo, the president of the World Trade Association, WTO organization, we were in Nigeria when she was Minister of Finance, and they said, well, everybody was talking about growth, and said, well, no, the problem is, everybody say growth. Now growth the chop, which is everybody talks about growth. Do we eat growth? We don't eat growth, and it's a big problem. And there are now questions around GDP and going beyond GDP. I think it was pretty abused by politicians. It's been abused all the time, and growth becoming be it all and all, without looking at how society functions and how best society could function. For instance, in Bhutan, the Bhutan measures happiness. They have this index of happiness, a happy society. And in that happiness, they measure how happy the society is. If we were to measure how happy South Africans are, I'm sure we will find that we are really very unhappy, including because of load sharing. So this actually brings the question at the center that we have asked. Do we measure what we treasure, or we treasure what we measure? And I think thus far, we have not measured what we treasure. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals and of course, the SDGs are tending to push us towards measuring what we treasure. And part of the interesting questions around what we treasure, such as happiness, love, etc., caring, these things are difficult to measure. So Mulana Mulana was seen by a friend walking around, and the friend asked, Mulana, what are you doing? And he was walking where there was a lamppost. Mulana said, I'm looking for my coin. And the friend asked him, where did you lose it? Mulana said, I don't know where I lost it. So he asked him, why are you looking for it there? He said, that's where there's light. So statistics and measurement tends to look at where there is light. And when there is no light, those things don't exist. So this is the contradictions of the the philosophy of science, that if you can't see it, it doesn't or exist, when actually it's a matter of the lens that you have is deficient.
Yeah, and it's such a difficult question, because also, as they say, as soon as the measuring stick, whatever it is that you're measuring, whether you're measuring happiness or growth or GDP or wealth or income or living standards, whatever it is, as soon as that yardstick, that measuring stick becomes the target, then of course you've got all sorts of other problems that creep in too, because those numbers are no longer clean numbers. Those numbers are incentivized to be massaged by policymakers or by CEOs or by boards or by anyone who is incentivized to meet those targets, often at the exclusion of all else. Because this is never a single parameter problem. I mean, human flourishing is a difficult problem. It's a complex, wicked problem. We have different values. You would place higher value on certain things to what I would. And my ideas of a flourishing life would be quite different to yours. And when we try and measure these things in very binary, very linear components, be sure to miss tricks and worse, actually create those perverse incentives. And that you mentioned the growth question, of course, because growth, with the way it's currently measured, is setting us up to essentially have zero-sum games. So you have to choose between, growth and sustainability, which is a false binary. But because of the way we measure these things, we kind of force people to pick one or the other, and not seeing it as sort of quadratic equations where we should be optimizing for a whole basket of wonderful things rather than just one thing. And of course, the incentives there from a political point of view are extraordinary, because it's very hard to win a political campaign or to get elected into office, or even onto the body corporate of your little street security WhatsApp group with the complicated campaign promise of, I will make life in general better for more people for longer. People want simple things like, I'll build the wall, or, I'll increase your social grants, or one metric sort of solutions, so much easier to sell to people, which comes back to what I was getting to right at the beginning. And that when it comes to portraying numbers and statistics, one of the biggest challenges is getting the story around them right? Because otherwise the stories around the numbers can be hijacked by essentially politicized actors that are trying to sell you something. Right? So do you have any advice for people trying to present facts in a measured, balanced manner, someone that's been doing this for most of your professional career, in a way that you're actually able to tell the right story, not the politically convenient story? How can we tell complicated stories in a way that they actually get heard and not drowned out by the very simple populist stories that seem to like take off like memes across society?
It's difficult. I mean, if I did, probably I would have seen statistics being used in South Africa. So I think I failed dismally on that one. I mean, if you think about Stiglitz, the laureate, economic laureate, Nobel Prize winner, talks about the GDP, and I mean, his critique to GDP, and then that's when Sarkozy established this GDP committee of Stiglitz for Tusi and somebody else. And in his submission, Stiglitz says, this GDP thing, you go to a nightclub and then you attend a striptease, take a lot of alcohol, and then from there you are drunk, your car gets smashed, you move from there and then you get home, the wife is very angry with you, she beats you up, and then you end up in hospital. All that GDP grows. So the way we measure these things has to be anchored in what are the desirable things in society. And I think when we look at climate change now, whether it's the GDP has been growing. So we are paying for green gas emissions and climate change. So we need first to define what society we would like to be, and then consider what then we will measure. And in that measurement process, we have to agree on the tools and how this measurement will take place and how it will be presented. That's the first thing about how does it get communicated without diluting the truth in the numbers, so that we end up saying that everybody, the facts we have are collective facts. No one has their own facts. So it's a skill that is a little complex and difficult. And having met Hans Rosling, the late Hans Rosling, I thought that I was beginning to realize how best the numbers can be presented.
Yeah, he did some
How
great
do you
work.
remove passion from the numbers? Because you have to be objective and be cold as the facts themselves. How do you do that when you are a human being? You get immersed in these numbers and send the message for as long as you keep the truth in the numbers. I mean, as a statistician general, I was often confronted by questions around, unemployment is high, it's above the norm, or it's low, that kind of thing. But I didn't have to have taste buds. That is, I must be cold towards these numbers so that they don't affect my mindset and influence how I collect them. But how do you do that? It's very, very difficult.
It's
extremely difficult. Yes, it's very difficult. That death rate has increased from, so you are supposed to tell the story by saying the number of deaths have increased in absolute numbers from 300 to 500, and percentage-wise, they have also increased. Well, do you say the situation has gotten worse? Of course, you could, but as a statistician general, you are not supposed to have taste buds. So the question you are asking is a very difficult one. How do you tell the story without tarnishing it, without politicizing it, without putting adverbs and adjectives to it? That's really a big issue. So you need to present the numbers and say, here are the numbers, these are the facts as they are, and then society must engage with these facts and then search for the truth in the facts themselves.
Decide where they
finally, the numbers settle with them, yeah.
But one of the things when it comes to looking at numbers, and it's something that I'm sure you know very well, is that the truth is seldom as bad or as good as it is made out over the braai or in the social media or, across the various political divides. And you mentioned Hans Rosling. I mean, did a lot of work looking at that, showing exactly how quite often the very scary things among us, yes, there are problems, there are challenges, but quite often when you actually look at those numbers really closely, things are not quite as bad or quite as good as you've been led to believe, because everyone's got an agenda. They're trying to sell you on that. But I did want to come back to one of the points that was both good and bad, and one of his famous charts that he put out. And this gets back to the work you've been doing, I think, yourself over the course of your career. In that, one of the things that he pointed out in his famous TED Talks when he went across the world was that in general, life is getting better on the long trend for most of us across many of the metrics that we least likely to fight about being the sort of metrics that we should be measuring. Things like life expectancy and child mortality. It's quite hard to disagree that having less babies die is a bad thing, right? So most of us agree that reducing childhood mortality is good for human society, and that over time that has trended in the right direction. Same with longevity. There are a few exceptions like the deaths of despair in America, but over time life expectancies are generally trending up. Over time, also quality of life in terms of access to education and access to food security have also tended up. And poverty has tended down. Only there's one major exception there, that if you start to look at those general trends, when you look into the various geographic regions, poverty's not tended down half as fast. In fact, might not even be tending down at all in sub-Saharan Africa, which is clearly where we live. This is clearly a problem. And it's obscured by looking at the macro global data, saying in general, things are getting better for most people most of the time. But there are exceptions to that. And that's probably one of the most challenging exceptions. This is talking about absolute poverty, not in terms of relative living standards. Like Americans like to complain about that. When on average, the average American is earning more than, like, you know, our top earners here in South Africa. It's a very different story, right? But real poverty, poverty in terms of, you know, food security, in terms of housing security, hasn't tended in the right direction. And that is something I know that you've looked at, this question of poverty. What are your thoughts on this topic, coming at it from a point of numbers rather than a point of emotions and politics? Because obviously there's so many different stories we can tell ourselves as to why this has happened, both historic and contemporary. But what are the numbers telling you, and what is your work looking at in this particular problem at the moment?
Well, I mean, the question of poverty is a very painful one because it's man-made. I mean, it's something that we have actually bought. I thought that expensive things are not so popular to buy. And poverty is one of those very, very expensive things that we have invested in all the time, year in, year out. It's very, very expensive. You get born, you die young. You get born, you don't go to work. You get born and then you are turned criminalized because then the opportunities are not there. So we got to get a prison where we lock you up. You get born, you fall prone to disease. Therefore, we have to create health systems to take care of you. So poverty is a very, very expensive endeavor. And our policies are not looking at matters poverty. Yes, poverty has reduced malnutrition and smallpox and all those diseases as a consequence of new technologies, new health systems, and so on and so on. But at Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, we've actually looked at poverty, and we are following on Amartya Sen's philosophy around empowerment as freedom. And one of the things that one has to understand is how poverty manifests itself. And he says that many are battered in all kinds of ways in life. And we must then use a different framework of measuring poverty. Rather than using $1 a day, we actually have to move to multidimensional poverty. And Rovello, who worked at the World Bank and introduced some kind of a $1 a day concept, the late Martin Rovello, was trying to address this himself, having experienced poverty. Now, Professor Sabine Alkir and James Foster, Alkir is our director at Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, where I am a consultant. They have developed a methodology of measuring poverty multidimensionally, so that these different dimensions that afflict society and arrest them from being better are the ways in which you measure this. And I'll say a few things about that. One of the dimensions is whether you have education or not. Two is whether there is a child has died in the household, whether there is somebody who is not in education in a school around the age, whether there is electricity, whether there is water. And so you look at these multidimensionally and measure society and individuals in the context of this multidimensional poverty. What has happened, quite interestingly, around this are 2 or 3 things. The first, particularly where this history of measurement of poverty started in a way that is multidimensional, is that there is policy coherence in the political sphere. Everybody sits down around the table, understand this multidimensional poverty, and agree that we want to reduce that number multidimensionally, and it organizes our politics in that kind of frame. Santos of Colombia was able to resolve the problem of the FARC the FARC guerrillas, and one of the conditions was, how do we measure that we are making life better? And they use the multidimensional instruments. In Costa Rica, the vice president we were with in Lebanon 2 months ago, her task was to look at multidimensional poverty. And she actually saw that this enabled her to manage cabinet as the vice president, focusing on this. Now, we had another lady who was in Panama, Michelle, who was the minister of social development in Panama. She was assigned this task, and hers was to bring her team, her colleagues together to address this multidimensional poverty issue. So you see the movement towards measuring this multidimensionally happening, particularly in Latin America. One advance in Latin America is that they now, one of the banks in Latin America, in Costa Rica, wanted to understand who are the multidimensionally poor in the banking, in their offices, and how are they multidimensionally poor. They realized after the results, and held by Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, that the difference between general multidimensional poverty and the bank's multidimensional poverty was just 2 percentage points difference. When the bank knew to be paid, to be the best payer, the person who served, the chief CEO of that, the CEO shed tears saying, how do you live? I mean, how do you manage? The CEO couldn't imagine himself managing when the PA was actually deeply multidimensionally poor because they had all other things to cover. What is the importance of this? The importance of this, and in the case of South Africa, is this. If we were to measure multidimensionally poor, we could actually, and especially both in the general population and amongst the employed in their spaces of employment, we shall have a much stronger instrument for social compacting than whatever we have done. Because the multidimensionally poor are in society. They may not have roads, they may not have water. And then that incentivizes the business to actually cooperate in resolving that problem, cooperating with government. And when we know where the multidimensionally poor are from as corporates, we'll have a different sense of how to deal with these problems. In Costa Rica, for instance, the bank then generated mechanisms for addressing credit and so on and so on and so on, and rolled it out industry-wide from that understanding of multidimensional poor. This is probably the way to go, and it is closer to what Bhutan does in terms of measuring happiness.
But those multi-dimensional layers are definitely where we need to be looking at it, because it's a complicated problem. It's not a simple problem. It's not just money, right? But what I wanted to ask you as well, because you have been looking at, as I said many times today, like this is something you've spent a lot of your career with, and that is when it comes to these levers or these measures of multi-dimensional poverty, have we come any closer to understanding what is the chicken and what is the proverbial egg, and what is the cause and what is the symptom, right? Because a lot of policies tends to address those mechanisms or those various different dimensions of poverty at the symptom level rather than at the cause level. And when you do treat these things at the symptom level, you're actually inadvertently incentivizing more of that, right? Like you said, we're investing in poverty rather than investing against it, right? And that's such a tricky thing to do, because you're constantly having to balance between what is urgent and what is important. And what is urgent is quite often not actually curing the problem. That's the other thing. So much of our systems, from NGOs to corporates to the public sector and the private sector, are actually so enmeshed in really the poverty economy that there are a lot of unpoor people who are incentivized in perpetuating those various different layers of poverty, which is a terrible situation we found ourselves in. We found ourselves in it because you mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation that we have bought poverty. That's kind of what we've done. And now it is embedded so deeply into our world economy. And as you said, it is a man-made construct. But unless we understand who's actually incentivized to keep this in place, we end up just treating the symptom layer, and we never get down to actually fixing the cause. Have you picked up through your academic research, through just your life experience as someone who's looked at these numbers and been part of the problems and the solutions at the public sector level and working in the academic sector too? Have you seen any places where you can say they've actually managed to turn those trends around at the deeper level rather than just trading water, like a lot of the solutions that we seem to get floated at the political level seem to do?
Going back to Latin America, particularly Costa Rica and Panama, as well as Colombia, through this lens of multidimensional poverty, they have been able to say, well, we'll build schools, we'll grow food, we'll do this, and engaged and allowed the poor to express themselves. And things are beginning to turn around there in terms of dealing with poverty by naming it, by naming what is your poverty. And then beyond naming it, then you know what is the source of that poverty. And at the heart of it, then you can actually say, what are the policies that we should implement to make people get out of this poverty? I don't think we do much in that respect in South Africa, not at all. I've looked at the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan. I've looked at all the other plans. They really are not moving us in the right direction. But I think if we understand this from a perspective of multidimensional poverty, what constrains us from releasing our energies, we are still going to struggle. But having said that, in the Economic Modeling Academy, how I got there was because of the tools that Applied Development Research Solutions introduced to me while I was a statistician general, particularly around the issues that we started with when we started the interview. How do you interpret statistics? And when I was interpreting the statistics, looking at the supply and use tables, which is the national account, what do you supply and where is it used? Where is the milk of the cow applied across industry and final household consumption and so on and so on? That's and then input-output tables, which is basically the matrix of that supply and use tables, and then a social accounting matrix, which says who in the national account, as we look at the national account, who benefits and who loses. So you look at that social account. I don't see South Africa using these tools that are there from statistics, and let alone the growth accounting framework, which has to deal with the what-if scenario. So I'm getting back to the point of what are the policies. We listened to the president, I'm sure, on the 10th when he reads the State of the Nation address. Right. He'll tell us about the inputs that we have created 3 committees or 3 boards at ESCOM. We will spend 40 million or 40 billion, that will be the Minister of Finance following in this space and in that space.
We might sponsor
none of them
in Europe, who knows?
None of them talks about these efforts that we are putting in place will generate 10 million jobs, which means that unemployment in South Africa will drop to about 10% when we have done that. Poverty will have been reduced multidimensionally because unemployment has become a core driver of poverty in South Africa. Between 2001 and 2011, its contribution to poverty moved from 35 to 42%, 40%. In 2011 to 2016, contribution of unemployment to poverty grew from that 40% to 52%. It doubled in half the time. In 5 years, it had doubled. That's acceleration. Now, if government cannot see that this acceleration is taking us to hell, then you don't know what they will see. And it's because they look at inputs, they don't look at outcomes and impacts. And this is a serious problem year in, year out. We are spewed with this litany of inputs. And then Parliament rises and applauds. I mean, if you look at the document of Treasury, both last year and this year, it says, in fact, this year, it says, South Africa will have 38% unemployment. And in terms of the budget that we are giving, that is the outcome of that budget. Now, as we see it as government and society, we should ask the question, is that an outcome we want to have? What are the core drivers that take us to that outcome? What do we need to change it? So we are heading for an election, and the government is saying, we'll give you more unemployment by 2026. We are going to give you less growth by 2026. And incidentally, the government that is sitting is a government that will contest elections. I wish they would actually articulate the outcomes of their policies in those kinds of terms, rather than in terms of the inputs. Because if anyone says to you, I will increase your unemployment from the current 34 to 38% by 2026, vote for me. That's the message.
That's effectively what we're doing. I mean, I made this comment,
Yes.
I think earlier this week too, like, you know, like we were surprised about load shedding and things, but, you know, we've invested in that, you know, like that's what we've chosen.
Yes,
that.
absolutely.
Policies, just government. It's like we have voted for the politicians who have put out those policies, and we know by now that, you know, like expecting a different outcome by doing the same thing over and again is a
Absolutely.
symptom, right?
It's crazy. Completely crazy.
So we've got to start believing in the laws of science, maths, and physics again. What goes up comes down, right? You know, and
Yeah, oh, yes.
and if you do the same thing again, you get the same results again.
Results, yes. Yeah.
Start trusting
Einstein says so.
and not our stories about them, which kind of brings this conversation right back to where we started. I think you make such a critical point there that we have to start thinking about the outcome, not just the input. And that, you know, if we want to head, if we're in Johannesburg and we want to go to Cape Town, if we get on the highway, it's going to take us up to Zimbabwe instead, we're going to end up in the wrong direction, right? Like, it doesn't matter how much effort you put in. If you set off going in the wrong direction, you're going to end up in the place you didn't intend to go. And we have to
go to, yes, yeah.
Those dots.
You just say, I'm going. You say, where? You say, it doesn't matter, but I'm going.
And you'll get there, right? So you'll get where you don't want to go. But it's worse than that, because we do know these are policies that we've tried. They have not worked. They have perpetuated the problem. We have to try something new, and we have to start calling these things to account. And yes, we are only individuals, but we've all got not just one vote, as I like to say, we've got many votes. You get to vote what you spend your money on every month, and where you spend your attention, and what stories you tell to each other. And we've got to exercise that. So we've got to speak sense to nonsense when we see and hear it, right? We've got to believe in the money as well as the physics.
Well, you see, at Economic Modeling Academy, and one of the work that we are doing, because I'm also a member of the Implementing scenarios, we actually use the ADRS tools to look at the policies that South Africa, the options that each scenario that we talked about depended, and it was defined by the kinds of policies that were chosen. So we put and assembled the different policies to see what outcomes each one of those different sets of policies will be. When you put those policies on the South African environment, the assessment that we make doesn't surprise and confirms where we are, that we are headed for the Gwara scenario, and those are the policies we have chosen. So there is a lot of deliberateness in the outcomes that we have. we may not intend them in our language, but we are so intentional about executing them that way, and they give us this result. And well, the president talks about the economic recovery and reconstruction plan and the district development model. You look at all those things, they are heading south into Guara. That's where those policies are going to lead us into. And then, of course, we don't have to burn the planet. But it is also important to live one more day so that you can assemble the kind of courage, the kind of instruments to deal with the planet.
Yeah, we have to be alive, right? You know, like
absolutely. So now we have stopped at the coal-fired power stations. We have said this is what we are doing, and those who have encouraged us to do so have gone back to coal. And we haven't asked them why they advised us that way. There is a level of disingenuity, deception, call it anything, that is rolled around our eyes. And we are not asking the president everywhere. You say, President, have you asked these people why they led you that path and they turned and left you there? That's the question that he must ask, so that he can take us into his confidence that that which we are doing is not something that is done behind our backs with a different set of agenda, and the consequences of which we are beginning to feel now, with people rotting in mosques, and or rather not mosques, but in mortuaries, with people going hungry, with people now beginning to snatch things so that they can eat. This is the life we are living. And it is the life where the wrong questions, or rather the right questions, the right answers come from the wrong questions. The question is, on this issue of just transition, have we asked the right questions? I think we have asked the wrong questions. The answers might be right, but the questions that we have asked are wrong. I would have started with the question, how have these people in Mpumalanga, in Secunda, in Vanderbilt Park and so on, how has been their health throughout the 100 years? How has their generation, one generation after the other, been impacted by the fumes of coke? And then focus on them and say, what is the atonement and what is the remedy? Then having done that, or at least put that firmly on the agenda, I can start thinking about how then do we deal with climate change? These people are forgotten completely. Nothing of that nature is happening to them generation after generation. So when you do that, you don't show intensity of being genuine about solving the problem. You haven't asked the right questions.
Yeah, and you got to solve it for the people.
That is the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not for hypothetical people. It may exist in the future, right? It's always
yeah, absolutely.
What is the balance between here and now and urgency and importance? And it's not a simple choice. It's not a choice. It's a quadratic equation. We have to consider all the parts all the time. We don't have the luxury to choose. But thank you so much for joining us today. I do have to let you go. And if people want to continue this conversation, because it feels like there's a whole nother conversation that needs to start right there, like with your closing comments there, where can if you're internet or not, and where can they read your work if you'd prefer them to just do that?
Well, I mean, I write very regularly, and probably you saw where I wrote my articles. I write every week 2 articles a week, both in the Sunday Times Live as well as in the Business Report. And more recently, it has really been about ESCOM, just transition, energy, the crisis that we are heading into, and the levels of poverty that, I don't know whether I said it, that 87% of the poor use electricity to cook. 80% of the poor use television to receive news and so on. At the rate at which we are going, the poor are going to suffer, and the democracy is going to be underserved by the lack of mass media to conscientize people. So when you look at those statistics, they affect the poor so adversely. Those who can afford will buy batteries and all this other stuff, but the poor have no luxury of that. And therefore, they will be forgotten in the democratic project.
So absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. We will definitely direct people towards your various columns to keep following on those stories. We are far from solving these problems. We are just beginning to realize, I think, collectively, just how deep in trouble we really are, because we've been coasting along for a good few years here in South Africa, thinking that someone else is going to come and solve our problems.
Some Messiah will come, yes, man.
Change our behavior and the people in charge start changing the policies. And we've got to call that to account. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sure we'd love to pick up this conversation in a follow-up episode when you're not so busy and we've got some more time and everything else going on.
No, that's fine.
It was an absolute pleasure.
No, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.